More fantastic.
Before I say anything about today's program, let me tell you what's coming down the road. We've got some very interesting things coming up, and I'll mention them kind of briefly. April 4th, Monday, and that is 7 p.m. The first Monday in April, we go back to our evening meetings. Dan Forrest of Onondaga County. Meet Major Asa and his wife Hannah when they share the hardships faced by soldiers and their families during the Revolutionary War. So we're going back to the Revolutionary War, period. We're going to go back further than that today. Just hang on. May 2nd. Boy, I really look forward to this. How many people remember some time ago when you could turn your radio on and hear Phil Markert? Okay. He's going to be here. Phil Markert. I don't know who wrote this. Maybe he did. It says a multi-talented local performer. Sounds like somebody you know, huh? Okay. Will present, and here's the name of his talk, a senior moment or two or three. I gotta tell you, when you talk about senior moments, Irene and I can really begin to relate to this now. The program will be held at the Fabius Christian Church. I'm just wondering, Sandy, why is it the church?
Because he needs a good piano.
Okay, yeah, as you may remember, he was a musical person. Yeah, that'll be at the church in May. And then, coming up in June, information about the former Fabius Future Farmers of America. And will be presented by Dale Barber, you must know him, and our own Sandy Baitlinger.
Yes?
You didn't become a farmer, did you?
It's always in my heart.
Well, you want to drop off some seed at her house?
And my brother's already done that.
If you were a member of this, and even if you weren't, if you remember that, please come and share your experience. That was once a really big part of the educational process for many people, many young people. Well, today, I think we've got the technical issues worked out, and we're going to have a talk on people who came here before we did, even before Charlie Shea did, or his father. Going back, did you ever stop to wonder as you look at the beautiful scenery around here, look at the sunsets and look at the lakes and all of that, who looked at these things before? Who looked at some of these things? Where did they come from? When did they come? Who were they? How do we know this? Well, our speaker is going to tell us about this, and we're going to go back in time. In fact, you may be wondering, North and South America, when did people come there? Huge continents. When did they do that?
Straight.
That's right. You can give the talk. They came, there's been a lot of arguments, a lot of evidence, a lot of talking, and a lot of studying, but what did happen, as Pam said, they came from Northeast Asia. They crossed over from Northeast Asia over into Alaska. And they did this at the time when it was extremely cold, there were glaciers, and you're thinking they came from probably very cold, terrible Northeast Asia into Alaska with the glaciers. Who was their travel agent? Well, they did, and the date has been a matter of some conjecture, but right now, a number that's accepted by a lot of people is somewhere around 15,000 years. And so as they came over 15,000 years and eventually worked their way down into South America. If you're wondering how they crossed the Pacific Ocean, It was a land bridge because it was so cold and the glaciers and it was so much water tied up in ice that it exposed some of the ground and they were able to walk up and eventually come down and eventually populate North and South America. Way back in school, you learn, way back in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. I can't sing that for you. But when he got here, where was he? And some people thought maybe he'd found a new way to get to India, which would be a wonderful idea. And so he saw people. And so what he did is, somebody said, you got people? We think you're in India, call them Indians. And that name, of course, is still around. But of course, they weren't. Our speaker today is Jonathan Just, who has apparently a very interesting career. You're a pharmacist during the daytime or whenever. And you're also an archaeologist, and he's got some of his collection over here. And he studied this thing, and he tells us he's going to concentrate on 1,000 to 1,500s, the Onondaga people, as being a major group living around here in this area. He's also very interested in sort of arousing in all of you the interest in looking for artifacts, protecting artifacts. How do we know anything about these people? He's going to be telling us that. So Jonathan Just, Dr. Jonathan Just, the program is yours. Thank you.
I would like to address the fact that Conklin Falls are available to be looked at, but now they are owned by 4 different persons, and so it's all private property. You can talk to those people and they'll let you go on. It is quite a walk down there, and they're glad to have you, but it is private property, so if you're going to go there and see them, which is a beautiful sight, you need to get permission. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, I should say. Thank you for having me to this historical society. It's my first time doing a speech like this. I recently started collecting my artifacts, and I never thought that I'd be in this position so quickly. What I'd like to do today, as mentioned by Chuck, is we're going to take a step way back in time, and we're going to start from the beginning and go right up through until about the year 1500, when we had American Indians or Native Americans living here, and what we can do to preserve the history that they left behind here for us today. So again, we'll start off looking at the Ice Age, the different Ice Ages and how they affected the migration of people across continents. From Alaska, how did they get to New York State? That is a huge area, and it happened relatively quickly. I know there might be a couple different schools of thoughts on this, but we're going to focus on the Bering Strait land bridge theory. And then we're going to look at the Iroquois Confederacy, the actual tribes in New York State coming together as one and putting down their war hammers and becoming the first democracy, which then laid a part in the formation of our own country. We'll look at some local villages, what you can expect to find, what they looked like at the time. Finding artifacts, if you're out in the field and you happen to stumble upon something, what are you looking for? What do you do with it? And then I'll have some time at the end for questions. I have some artifacts on the table over there, which I'm happy to have everyone get up and look at. Lost my mic. Can you hear me okay? No. Not. It is? No. Got it? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Maybe the Verizon commercials. Okay. So, let's get started. The Ice Ages. Climatologists have been able to go back in Earth's history about 2.4 billion years. And I don't know how, but I keep losing the microphone. supposed to flash?
Here it goes. Okay.
That's good, okay.
Here.
I can move it back. It just went off.
Okay. Sure. Want the handheld?
I can do the handheld. I can do the handheld.
Let's try that.
We're able to look,
against your mouth, yeah.
we're able to look at, there we go, how's that? We're able to look at the surface temperature of the Earth. And as one would deduce, as the temperature drops, it typically coincides with something like winter or, in extreme cases, ice ages. Now, in Earth's history, there hasn't been just one ice age that you might hear about, but there's been 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 major ice ages. But for the purposes of our talk today, we'll be focusing more on the most recent one, there on the right-hand side, which we call the current ice age. Now, if you look at these lines on the graph, the temperature, you'll see how they're nice and steady, sloping, very gentle. But when you open that up and you take a look a little bit closer, you find something like this. This entire red box is that last slope in the current ice age, the ice age that we're coming out of right now. And that is, of course, a debate all on its own, but the temperature is rising, and it is in part due to the natural chain of events that happens on Earth. Again, within the ice age, we see rises and falls in global surface temperature, and that creates the waxing and waning of ice sheets over continents. And this is how the Finger Lakes were formed. As the ice waxed and waned, it would come down and scrape some dirt away, recede and leave a deposit somewhere maybe, bring it back down. Over time, that's how we developed the Great Lakes, the Finger Lakes, and other features like that. But again, for the intents of this program, we're going to focus on the more relevant time period, which in yellow there, might be a little hard to see, is about 25,000 years ago. On a lot of my slides at the top, you'll see a green box here, and that's a rough timeline. I try to highlight that so that you can tell approximately where we are in time. And right now, we're going to start off at around 25,000 years ago. At this point, we reach what is known as maximal glaciation. This is the height of the current ice age, the ice age that we're coming out of now. Ice reached as far south as Indiana, and it was up to 1 or 2 kilometers thick in some parts. For a couple 100,000 years, our descendants in Africa had been doing pretty well. The ice did reach them in some small portion, especially at higher elevations, but they were able to evolve into different species and travel where they could, notably throughout Africa, into Europe, and of course into Asia. Their movement, of course, was blocked by these massive ice sheets, largely. Some of them, I'm sure, were able to make habitats in these colder, desolate areas, but the majority of them stayed where it was relatively warm, just like we're inside today, not outside giving a presentation. Fast forward to about 18,000 years ago, and this is when the temperature really started to rise and the ice sheet started to recede a little bit. And that allowed people from Asia to travel across this land bridge. They went from what is now about the Koreas in through Russia, across into Alaska, and settled a campsite there, or some sort of little village in Alaska around the year 12,000 before present. From that point, and at various times, they then spread throughout North America and down south into Southern America. So we know how they got here. That's at least one theory. There's another theory that people may have come from Europe the opposite direction. But that's the mainstream theory. Once they got to the Americas, what happened? How did they get to New York? That is a long distance from Alaska to New York, and even longer from Alaska to South America. But we're here in Fabius, so we're going to talk about Fabius, not Peru and Belize today. Taking a step backward, this is another map showing the movement of humans over time. The red being the earliest humans. They originally started off in Africa here, and spread northward. And as they evolved into different species, they kind of branched off and found their own niches throughout the existing world at the time. If we focus in on the Americas at the time, again, 15,000, 12,000, somewhere in that time frame, depending on who you ask, it could go back as far as 40,000 years ago, there were people making their way into the Americas. For my presentation, I'm going to stick with the area around 12, 15,000 years ago. Why? Why this pattern of migration from Alaska down towards Louisiana and Florida and south into Southern America and not straight across? Why didn't they start at the point where they reached Alaska and just travel in all directions? Well, the reason is pretty simple. We're still talking about being in an ice age. There was a huge ice block covering North America. At 18,000 BC, this is roughly what North America would have looked like, covered by a gigantic sheet of ice. If we fast forward a few thousand years, the global temperature is increasing ever more so, and that ice sheet begins to recede. Again, fast forward a few thousand more years, and we're right at that mark at about 12,000 BC, where we know people had traveled across that land bridge and made it into America and established at least some semi-permanent settlement. As one would expect, as we continue throughout history, the land sheet gets smaller and smaller and now is isolated to basically the North Pole. But as it receded, it allowed the people to move where there wasn't a gigantic covering of ice. And notably, that would have been in a southerly and easterly direction. They could not move this way, due east, because of the ice. They would travel in these valleys and areas where it was easier for them to go, just like water, the path of least resistance. Further on in time, as we approach around the year 10,000 BC, there was a toddler found recently in Montana, and DNA testing had actually shown that she was about 10,000 years old. I tried to find some pictures of the excavation or of the toddler herself. I couldn't find anything, but you'll have to take my word for it.
What's the dinosaurs? Because they're out there too, but what are they?
The dinosaurs, 65 million years ago. So they were way before our time. Now, at this time, we did have, I'm not exactly sure when there were mastodon in North America, and they were hunted all over the place. In fact, I read an article recently, which a gentleman had found some projectile points, and they were able to find mammoth or mastodon protein embedded in those projectile points. But the dinosaurs were long gone. So we know that they're in the Americas, and we know that they're traveling eastward. That great ice sheet is moving northward every year, and even at a snail's pace. But how did they get into New York? And more specifically, how did we develop these tribes, the confederacies that we know of today, which actually still exists? Going back a little bit to the Ice Age, this is a picture, a topographic map of New York State as it looks today. The greener areas are low-lying areas, and of course you have the Adirondacks up here, the Catskills down here. Those are all higher elevation areas. The Great Lakes drain out of the St. Lawrence River north and eventually into the ocean. But during the time of the Ice Age, there was this ice cap that had blocked off that waterway. And as a consequence, what we know as Lake Ontario essentially was all of this low-lying area. It was all filled in with water. And that's what we call Lake Iroquois. So even some of the Finger Lakes at that time were not completely surrounded by land, but were more surrounded by water than what we're used to today. And this is another map showing the same thing, but I've thrown on here some points. 10,000 BC. These are some rough areas where we know that humans had occupied. At roughly 10,000 BC, maybe 8,000 BC. And this is the period known as the Archaic era. So 8,000 to 2000 BC. Sporadic settlements. These were the hunter-gatherers that we learned about in school. They would travel following large herds of animals as they moved through these newly developed plains that resulted from the glaciers receding. Picking berries, nuts, whatever they could. They would stay for a brief period of time, make their tools, live their lives, and move on in a short period of time. They had crude tools, relatively speaking, during this period of time. You'll see a lot of hammer stones, pretty cool looking arrowheads, but nonetheless crude compared to more modern American Indians. And these are some of those points that you may find in an archaic type site. I very highly doubt that anyone in Fabius, New York is going to find any of these points. These are Clovis points, and we have Crowfield points here. I know there are one or two members in the audience who have some of these points. More likely to find them north or in the western area of the U.S. If you find one of these, please call me. Yeah, I actually did. I found that one. I found it recently in this town.
Great.
Yep. Another map of New York State. Three main theories of how the people, the tribes of New York State, those 5 nations or 6 nations later on, came to be. One hypothesis is the southern hypothesis, stating that there were a group of people that came from the Mississippi Valley, right around down in here, and brought their culture and their ideas northward into New York. There's a second theory of the northern hypothesis, where natives from the St. Lawrence area came south and brought their ideas with them. And then a third one, the in situ model, which states that basically those archaic people who had been here just evolved over time into the 6 nations that we have today. Depending on which professional archaeologists you ask, they will fight for one over the other. They are debated. I think it's a mixture of possibly all 3 of these. We may never know for sure. So at the Archaic era, this area in red here, it was controlled by the Algonquins. So that's kind of like the brothers of the Iroquois. And you'll note that New York State, which is right in here, really wasn't in their territory. Neither was Ohio, Pennsylvania. And this is where this southern theory comes into play. We had these Owasco, this Owasco culture, move in from the south up into that unoccupied territory or less occupied territory. And along with their culture, they brought things like farming, maize or Indian corn, beans and squash, the 3 sisters that we've probably heard of before. They brought that into central New York or into the area that was not controlled by the Algonquins. And that led to the development of larger villages. You no longer had to send out hunting parties 10 miles away from your camp and bring back deer every couple months. You could grow all of these plants in a confined space, and it also provided excellent nutrition to the natives who grew it, which thereby increased their population. So now that green area has become Iroquois territory because they moved in, they established villages, they were great farmers, they were great hunters as well. They used all the traits that they had learned over the past 10,000 years of moving from Alaska down into New York. And of course, on their borders with these Algonquin tribes was warfare. Now, warfare really meant two things: going into a neighboring tribe, killing them, taking what you could, and showing a show of force. We're here to stay. Don't mess with us because we're not going anywhere. But there's a second side of that, and it was that they didn't just go in and slaughter people in adjacent villages. What they would do sometimes is actually bring them into their own villages and assimilate them and adopt their cultures. Something that we see later on as we observe ceramics, like the pottery that I have sitting over there. There's one archaeologist in particular back in the 40s and 50s who was able to look at pottery styles throughout history and at different sites in New York and said, well, this design originated in the north, this one originated in Ohio, and so on and so forth. And that's where those three theories really kind of come together. At around 1450, we really had these 5 or 6 established nations in New York State. The Algonquins really, I think, were no longer a large threat to them because the Iroquois had been established. They were a very powerful force, and there was fighting amongst them at the beginning, but around this time, 1450, they said, you know what, enough is enough. We are all the same people. Let's band together. And what they did is, they took the central nation, which is the Onondaga Nation, which we would presently be in now if the map looked like it did back then. They would send delegates from outlying areas into this central state, just like we do to Washington, D.C. We send our delegates, or they choose to go there whenever they want, but they will go there and they'll hash out matters of federal or state interest and work it out there. And that's exactly what the natives did. They would travel to the Onondaga Nation and they would have their meetings there. And that was the first democracy in America, essentially. In fact, Benjamin Franklin spoke with some members of the Onondaga, and the Onondaga picked up a stick and he broke it. And he said, you see how weak this one stick is? And then he picked up a bundle of sticks and he tried to break it and it wouldn't break. And he said that multiple sticks or multiple entities put together are stronger than one individually. And that is noted on the back of a lot of our currency today. In one of the eagle's talons, you'll see that he's holding a bundle of arrows, and that's what it stems from.
They actually, the Constitutional Congress asked a group of Native Americans to come talk to them while they were writing.
I had heard that that is the case, but the proof for it, I couldn't tell you. I couldn't cite any sources that say whether or not. Mike, do you have any input on that? No. But I do know that Benjamin Franklin did specifically speak with them. And Ray Halbritter, he runs the Turning Stone Casino from the United Nation, he gave a documentary on TV and he explained the history behind the initial meeting of the founding fathers of America and the Iroquois and how they were able to incorporate some of their beliefs into our Constitution.
Is that still available on TV or online?
I don't know. I'm sure you could purchase the episode from the History Channel, but to find it again, they rerun it all the time. I mean, they rerun everything all the time. So you're bound to see it if you watch the History Channel as much as I do. So what's the proof? This is the schematic that I was talking about, that gentleman, his name was McNeish, who looked at the different pottery styles all over the Northeast. And he was able to determine that not only the pottery styles, but other attributes from sites in and around New York eventually led down to one particular people. Whether he's right or not is yet to be determined, but to the best of our knowledge, it makes sense. It's very logical that patterns and cultures evolve over time, and by tracing them through archaeological evidence, you can come to this one conclusion that we must have a beginning somewhere, and throughout time they branch off. And this is what he would have been looking at, something like this. In these vessels, you may not be able to see it because the pictures are small, but they have similar shapes, but they are different. Some of them are very round, almost perfectly spherical, like that one there, this one in the upper left-hand corner, or some that are a little bit more oblong. And then the details up here in the neck and the collar are different, depending on which tribe you're looking at. And throughout time, that changed, the shape of them changed, the way they were used changed. By tracing that all back, we're able to determine, again, those Owasco people most likely were the people who brought these ideas into central New York. Now, getting into the Fabius part, or the Onondaga people part of the presentation, local villages. So what about right here? The Ice Age is great, and that little toddler that they found in Montana was a great discovery for archaeology, but for us in this room, who maybe want to find some arrowheads this spring, what does this mean for us? This is Champlain's map of the Northeast, 1632. It's a little rough. If we throw in an image of New York State over top of it, you can barely make out the outline of New York State. Lake Champlain would be somewhere up here. You've got the island down here. Lake Ontario, a little bit off kilter. But if we blow it up, and again, look at the outline of New York State, you see some features that are a little bit more prominent. We have the Hudson River flowing north and into the sea.
It does?
South.
It runs to the south. I had it going up. You're right. Nonetheless, it is on the map. We have the Mohawk River, which we know runs more westernly.
Runs east.
Runs east to west, but it empties into the other river, and that the Hudson. And then these might be the Finger Lakes. I'm not entirely sure because they're quite a ways away from where they should be. But again, if you look at this being Lake Ontario, it would make sense that they are south of Lake Ontario. 1632, they didn't really have great GPS or anything back then, so we'll let them have it. But the important thing on this map is that when you take away features like that and you look at these settlements that he mapped, they were all over the place. The English or the Europeans had been here for maybe 50 years, maybe a little bit less. There are a couple European villages in New York State at the time, probably more so down along New York City. But these stars here indicate Native American villages, and they were everywhere. They were well established. When we look specifically at the Onondaga throughout time, the first villages appear here, and this would be around the year 0, just as a reference. This is year 0. Throughout time, a couple hundred years advance, the villages move. So they deplete the resources around them. Maybe the soil isn't good for farming anymore. Maybe there was a conflict with a neighboring tribe. Whatever the reason, they did move around generation after generation. Much like we did, as our towns and cities grew, we had to move further west and until we reached the Pacific, and now we're just filling in the country. A couple hundred years pass, they again moved further east, and again a little bit further south, down a little bit closer to where we are, mainly in the Pompey Hills, and then lastly, the most recent sites are up a little bit north of about Casanova Lake, a little bit north of where we are here. But these are ones that we know about. That doesn't mean that there aren't some down here in Fabius or even over here in the Tully that we don't know about. But we do know that as a trend, the Onondaga were moving in this direction from their beginning as a tribe. When we think about native New York, so when the American Indians were here, or when the first European settlers came, this is probably what you think of, is just a vast, dense forest. That's what we assume. And that's entirely wrong. There are accounts of early explorers who came here and expected to find just that, and don't get me wrong, there were large swaths of great forest, but there were also huge expanses of prairie that had been created by the Native Americans. They did it with a technique called slash and burn, which we still use today. They would cut down the trees, they would let everything dry out, and they would set it on fire. And there were accounts of Jesuits living with the natives in their longhouses as they were trying to convert them to Catholicism. And they would go out and just set these fields on fire for fun. Huge, acres and acres and acres, and just set them on fire. It served a couple purposes. You could see further, so if there were an enemy approaching or if there was a game animal out there, you could see farther. You had a better vantage point from where you were, say at your fort. But the ashes created by doing this slash and burn also added some nutrients into the soil, balanced the pH, and it made for great farming.
Alkaline,
Alkaline, yes,
like potash.
like potash, and that's how you can make soap still out of ashes because it is so alkaline. And this is what would have resulted is basically a barren landscape, or what the Romans would call tabula rasa, blank slate, where you could do with whatever you want, because there was nothing growing there. There were no trees blocking the sunlight. There were no weeds. You could just create your own garden, do whatever you wanted. The most exciting part, for me at least, villages. So what did the villages look like? Where were they? Where are they? There are villages out here in Fabius, I guarantee it, that have not been found yet. This town did not receive as much attention as a place like Pompey, just because of the quantity of things that were plowed up. It receives tons of attention over 200 or 300 years. That places like Fabius, Tully, and Atisco were basically just ignored. And I know that there are sites in each of those other towns as well. Nonetheless, in this area, in the hills, so away from the lowlands, villages would occupy a hillside, generally. Most often it would have steep, sloping sides, and that would aid to get them higher up off the ground so that they could see a farther distance, maybe communicate with a distant tribe that they could see, but it would also make an attack up that hill much harder if there were an enemy approaching. They did like swamps. What they would do is they would run their deer, moose, mammoth maybe, into a swamp where they couldn't really, they weren't as mobile. And
But on a high level, would there be, have more control of the water?
you, in most cases, yes, it depends on the land. You can go up into highland forest, and there are some swampy areas up there, and the elevation is very, very high up there. So it depends on the subsoil, the bedrock, if it penetrates high enough into the altitude to hold water. There are a lot of variables, but generally, yes, these would have been dried out areas. Very flat, obviously. Not many people build a house on a hill and have to walk up to their car in the morning. It's just convenient to be on a flat surface. And lastly, down in the bottom right-hand corner, a water source is always important, especially a close water source, because they had to hike all of that water up that hill and into their neighborhood. They didn't want to have to travel a far distance. In fact, sometimes what they would do, if they did have to travel, they would set up jars of water ahead of time along the way so that you had a resting point where they might give you some corn or some beans, something to munch on and drink, and stop and rest and continue onward. Taking a close-up view of the actual village itself, you see that this one has a palisade wall around it. And what they would do is they would dig a trench and they would erect these basically trees that they had cut down, straight up and down, bury them in the soil, and that would surround almost all the village. Not all the time, but in a large majority of the time it would surround it, and it served to protect them, again, from animals or enemies. But it was also a limit almost of the village. So outside of this, you are outside of village limits. And of course, you have inside the village, their longhouses. This is a picture that is, it's a little bit hard to see with the lighting here, but this is what it would have looked like building a palisade wall. So they have already dug their trench and erected their vertical palisades. And now they're weaving smaller saplings or branches or whatever they could in between them to create almost an indestructible wall. Yes?
And I guess it would be now 2 slides ago, there was a big wall in the background. Was that a picture of the wall? That big brown?
Oh.
No. Yeah.
Back here?
Yes.
I believe,
Yeah, that's part of it.
yes, I believe you're right. The photograph is a little grainy, especially from back here. I'm only 27, but the eyes are starting to go.
Go forward one more slide.
And that-
The huge black wall in the background.
Right.
That's
And
different tree.
No, that's just the shadow.
So we have a debate. It's either trees or a palisade wall.
Oh, it's one picture superimposed on another.
What is that? That brown.
You've got a palace. And then there's a tree. Yeah, there's a palace.
That's the wall to show.
And then behind it is a forest.
I think it's one picture superimposed on another. Look at them separately, and that explains that black wall.
You're right.
IQ test.
This is a computerized image. This is taken of a model, but in Wisconsin they did, in the museum, there's a Iroquois museum that actually made a model. And it looks very similar to the painter's rendition of it. But nonetheless, the version that I can get it's very grainy. This, right here?
That's no teepee.
This here? No, we're far beyond teepees at this point. You would find teepees in the Midwest and out where it was drier. These are longhouses, and I'll show you a better picture of a longhouse in just a second. I think it's just the image. As I was explaining to this lady here, there's a museum out in Wisconsin or Minnesota, somewhere up in the northern part. They have a large Iroquois museum, and they have a model of this site or a site just like this. And I think what this image is a painter's rendition of that. And so it's a little bit fuzzy. It's kind of hard. Just to show the outline of a village, I thought it would be appropriate, but then when you project it onto a large screen like this, it makes it a little bit harder to see.
Oh, it's Walmart.
This is a little bit more clear. This is a Mohawk village, and you can clearly see the palisaded wall completely surrounding the entire village. It would have little openings where a person could get in or out, but it was the majority of it was just closed right off, sealed right off. And within it, you had longhouses which were generally parallel to one another, but in the event that one burned down or one was too small for a family, they would expand it. They would tear down the other ones and maybe build one perpendicular to the others. We see that in some of the sites. It depends on what was going on in that village at the time. This is a photograph of the outline of a longhouse, and you can tell why it's called a longhouse. This is from the Howlett Hill site, I believe, if memory serves. And there's a gentleman standing right there, probably 5.5, 6 feet tall, and you could just see how huge this structure is. I couldn't even tell you how many people would fit inside of this one building here. But they did have things, if you've ever been on a Navy vessel, the bunk beds that hang from chains, that they had bedding in there like that. They had what these are called features, hearths where they could cook, where they would heat the cabin during the winter time, all down the center here. So
Tell us about it during your bid out. If you want to see a one action, go there.
and that might be the next image right there. There are several of these. This is a longhouse. So traditionally built, they would take saplings and make their frame, arch them and tie them together if necessary, and run, just like you would build a frame house. And then they would cover it with sheets of ash or hickory bark, whatever they could harvest, the local materials, and then tie it down with these exterior type vines or saplings or whatever they had available to them. Little tiny doorways that you might even have to crouch into to get into, with possibly a leather flap over it. But they're very spacious inside. If you go to this museum in the Capitol down in Albany, they have one of these partially reconstructed, and you can see both the exterior and the interior, and they have like wax figurines of Native Americans performing certain tasks within the building itself. It's actually pretty interesting.
They had fire within the
They
long
did, they had fire within it, and they generally had holes up at the top, small holes to allow the smoke and, very hot gases to escape. There are instances where they burned down, whether it was intentional. We know George Washington came up to around where the mall is now and burned an Onondaga village. But they did set fire, and they would rebuild. But they lived like this for hundreds or thousands of years, so they had a pretty well-established campfire system within their own home.
Can I say something? If you want to see a real one and go inside it, the Native Americans built one in Victor, New York, and it's Gadang Gadang, it's called. But if you just Google Victor, and it's right off the thruway, it's not far at all. So if you want to go there, and they build fires for you and everything. And now they have a visitor center that I haven't seen that's supposed to be spectacular. So you can go in there and they talk to you, they build a fire, they show you how it's going up and everything. They use flint, and it feels to me very, and then they have days that you can go visit. They'll have Native American Indian days where they do lacrosse and all kinds of stuff, and they invite you to join in if you want to.
There are other places outside of Victor, New York also that have museums inside longhouses like that. I can't think of it. There's a museum down near Gilboa, which is southeast of here, but there are several throughout the state, and Victor being another one of them. The state fairgrounds even had, I don't even know if that's there anymore, but at the Native American Center, they did have some smaller longhouses back there. The farming practice that the Owasco people supposedly brought from the south, known as the Three Sisters, is something that some people actually still use today. And it uses corn. We have one stalk here in the foreground and then a field of it in the background. Beans or other type of legume, which would grow around the corn being the support post, and they wouldn't interfere or obliterate the sunlight to each other. They would work in perfect harmony. And then lastly, squash, which covered the ground. And the squash has almost a prickly type leaf and very broad leaves, and that would keep out critters, and it would also keep the soil cool and moist so that it wouldn't be too dry for the corn and the beans to grow. And when harvest season came, they would harvest whatever they could. They would bury some of it, they would store some of it in jars, leather bags, I suppose, however they could, and then use that throughout winter time for sustenance, in addition to your typical farming, fishing. I was lucky enough at a site close to here to find a handful of carbonized squash seeds, and these are two of them. One of them, this one here on the left, actually looks almost perfect enough where you could plant it. The rest of them are obviously, if you look at them, they're over in one of my display cases, very badly charred. And I broke one of them open and there is nothing inside, so they're not going to grow. But these were found about 18 inches underneath the soil of the level of the surface. They were not dropped there yesterday. These, along with other artifacts, are from a fire pit. And this is from a local area.
Can you do carbon dating on those?
Kind of, yep. And I've actually played with the idea, but this is the site here, and you can see the date right there, 1965, 66. Someone had already excavated a large majority of the area, and a lot of the things were carbon dated. So there's really no need for me to spend my money to further carbon date. If I find something spectacular, something that doesn't fit, then maybe I will, but it is relatively costly. But again, at the site I'm working at, and this is on an elevated piece of land, very flat, with a nearby water source. It's very, very small. It's almost like an outpost, like a hunting village. There's one identified house, if you could even call it that, within the structure, and it's not even listed on this map, I don't believe.
Where is this?
This is the structure.
I mean, what
Okay.
city is this near?
This is up near Casanova.
Oh, wow.
Several features, fires, hearths, granaries, pits where they would dump their corn, foam pits, things like that. And then this peculiar circular thing on the western edge, we don't really entirely know what that was. Maybe for storing meats or something like that to deter animals from getting in there. We don't really know. But I'm working on this site. I did all last summer, and I will continue to do so. I have my artifact, some of them over there.
You have
Quite
help?
interesting. I don't have any help,
You
no.
want help?
Um,
Not really?
maybe. I'll tell you what, I thought I was gonna have a heart attack climbing up to it on the first try. It's that high of an elevation, and a lot of these sites are.
I
I
did that, but I
pulled-
wasn't on the
Can't-
Oh, no, not yourself, okay.
I'm a good climber, but I'm not going to that. And I was just thinking, SU, they have a lot of students there.
They have been there.
Really
SU has been there. The owner of the land used to let SU come down because he was friends with the professor there. And they,
Armstrong?
I don't know.
Oh,
They did incredible damage to certain areas of the site.
oh,
And I have found scraps of their tools and their screens just littered everywhere. So I prefer, and I have sole permission to be there so that I can control what is going on. If we look at the topography of this area, Fabius, you'll know something like Highland Forest, and that is actually Highland Forest. This is provided via Google Terrain. If you've ever hiked in Highland Forest, and you know right at the Skyline Lodge, it seems like you can see forever because it's so high up. High ground serves as protection, as I previously mentioned. We know that there is at least one, maybe 2 or 3 sites within the bounds of Highland Forest. Where exactly they are, there are only 1 or 2 people who know, but these high grounds were excellent places to build a village. They had water sources within the forest itself, or right next door, we have the reservoir, which of course back in 1500 wasn't even nearly the size that it is, if it even existed as a body of water. But you also have valleys in the immediate area, where maybe the deer or larger game would go down, feed on grass, things like that. This is a map of Onondaga County. One of the most noted archaeologists, William Beecham, my archaeological chapter is named after him, created this map, and he did one for the entire state of New York. And it shows in red, which again, owing to the image quality, it's very grainy, so you may not be able to pick out the colors very well. I tried to doctor it a little bit, but it didn't work. You can see everything in red is a site or a feature of Native Americans. And again, I'll point out that Atisco, the other side of Atisco, which would be your Spafford, Bordino, Tully, Fabius, were essentially left out. There's a little trace of red in Fabius here. But Pompey received a lot of attention, as did Baldwinsville, which is where Dr. Beecham lives. So he started there, and then he eventually moved on further. And when people got wind of all the things going on in Pompey, it was like the gold rush, I suppose. Everybody came and everybody was digging. Go to Pompey today and ask if you can walk a farmer's field and look for arrowheads. You'll get laughed at. I've done it.
Did you find him?
He laughed at me,
But
and I left. Yeah, I did not look.
I would have looked.
I've never been shot, and I don't intend to be. So if we zoom in on Pompey again, maybe you can see this a little bit better, but you notice all of the red circles, these are all earthworks. So that would have been maybe a farming plot where they had built up the soil a little bit. That would keep the water in as opposed to draining off of the surface. These little teepee shapes were actually village sites all over Pompey. And that is, if we go back to the map of Onondagas, their movement from the west to the east, this is exactly where those sites were. Fabius, mysteriously blank. A little trace of evidence here, and we know that I found one arrowhead in the locals field here in the town of Fabius. Just a stray find, no villages that I've been able to come up with. But that's part of the reason why I'm here, is because of the lack of people who have artifact hunted or found things in Fabius. They're out there and they can be found. And everyone has dug through Pompey so much, I don't even know where all those artifacts are. And the history associated with it is lost. Fabius is a blank slate, essentially. If we were all to go out to our land right now, if it were plowed and find some arrowheads, we could add to the archaeological record like you wouldn't believe. And it would be great for the town of Pompey, it would be great for New York State, it would be great for the Onondaga people, because it adds to their history and culture as well. Zooming out, again, we have Highland Forest, we have Fabius here, Berwyn, and Pompey. Look at all the peaks and valleys. We have the major rivers running north and south through here. If this is Fabius, the town of Fabius here, you can't tell me that there aren't sites in there. There have to be, but they just haven't been discovered yet.
Not much water right here.
I'm sorry?
Not much water. They were looking for water nearby.
That could be, but it also depends on the time period. I mean, if you go back to 10,000 years ago, look at the size of Lake Ontario. It was almost twice as large. The sea levels were higher, the rivers were higher, there was much more water. An adult human needs 1 to 2 liters of water a day, and if you're feeding an entire community, yeah, maybe they would have to walk for some water, but you have to be protected, you have to farm, you have to hunt, so taking all that into consideration, I think Fabius is a great place that hasn't yet been uncovered enough to find those sites. So what are we going to find if you go out in your field after you leave here? The first points that I showed you, the archaic era points, are over here on the left-hand side. That's 10,000 years ago. There probably were not people in Fabius at 10,000 years ago. And if so, they were probably moving pretty quickly following elk or moose or whatever through the area. That would be an extremely rare find. The people who lived here maybe 1300 to 15, 16, 1700, and that puts us at these last 3 points here. Again, I have some over there. Al of France was heavily vested in archaeology, especially in Highland Forest and the area. He has some in the glass and wooden cabinet over there along the wall, and you'll notice the similarity of those points to these, the Levana and Madison points. Those are going to be the most common. They're referred to by some people as bird points because they're very small, but they are sharp enough to bring down a deer. They can do some serious damage. And then later on, as Europeans came, we have brass and copper points, steel tools perhaps. This is what they look like. They're only about 1 inch long. They're easy to miss if you don't know what you're looking for. But they have this almost isosceles triangle shape. Some of them have a little curve to the base here, some of them don't. We have some brass ones up here, you can tell by the greenish color. Maybe a nail that was given to the natives, which they loved because they could nail doors to their longhouses. They would actually burn the longhouse down and recover the nails, just like the early American settlers would do because they were so precious. This one has been bent into a fish hook. Some wampum beads up at the top here, and that's simply just marine shell that has been drilled through the center and polished, which again, I have some in my collection that I found at my site. Pottery. You may find some pottery in your field. And you may have walked over pottery in your field 100,000 times and you would never know it because it has a certain look to it that you might just think is a rock or a clump of clay, but it has an almost brick-like appearance. And if you look at, I have one jar, my laser will point on it right there. That's an authentic 1500s Seneca jar. And that's the color of a pottery shard that you might find in your field.
So it looks like rusty stuff?
Almost, baked clay. And that one alone has several different colors around it based on how they used it for cooking. Whether they suspended it over a fire or put it in ashes, how it broke. There are lots of minerals in the soil. A lot of things can influence the color of pottery, but it does have a very distinct look in that it's usually very smooth, or if it's the interior of the pot showing, it is often jet black. And there are a few things that you'll find in your fields that are jet black. Sometimes that's what grabs my attention more so than the exterior.
Have you found a lot in your Waterloo and Geneva and that kind of stuff?
I have not.
Or heard of anybody that's found a lot in Native American pottery here?
Yes.
Because that's clay soil. And then they have about 10 brick factories there in the early 1800s. Working on Americans.
Right, are real bricks, right. Actually, this face is from the site that I've been working at. It's about 1 inch wide, and there was a brick factory about half a mile away from this. They had very, very good clay. You can tell that it's a face, and I wasn't sure at first, but you can clearly see the eyes, the raised portion of the nose and the small depression underneath the nose and above the lip, and then a mouth. This may have been made to apply to the exterior of a pottery vessel, or maybe it was just a standalone type token or toy, something like that. It's debatable, but it's a great find nonetheless. Probably something that you're not going to encounter very often, but they are out there. Clay pipes are another thing. With the heavy machinery that we use now to plow and till our farmland, these are pretty much all but destroyed unless you get down underneath the surface or of where that plow can reach. But you may find fragments of a pipe like that. The more durable stone tools are gonna be your, things like your grooved axe heads, maybe your mortars, which they would have used to grind up corn, beans, or any sort of pill type material. Maybe a net sinker that has a groove in it. They would tie their hemp ropes around that and weigh down a net to catch birds or fish, maybe even throw it over their longhouse. These you might find more common in a farm field because these can take the whack of a plow much easier than that pottery vessel over there. Things that you're probably not going to find, and I wouldn't waste your time trying to look for them. Vegetation. Those beans, those squash seeds rather, that I found were incredibly rare, to me at least. I never expected to find something like that. But this is one of those pits where they would have taken their corn after harvest and charred it, buried it over for future use, and for one reason or another it was forgotten about. And after I don't know how many hundreds of years, this is what we have left. Now this looks like it's a drier type soil, so this is probably from the western area. When you have mix in the moisture of our loamy soil here, the vegetation just really isn't going to be there. Leather. Of course, leather comes from animals. It is tanned and it will stand up for a certain length of time, but if it's in the ground for 600-700 years, you're not going to be able to recover any of it. If you do, it would be very rare and in small and very fragile pieces. And also the ash baskets that the natives used to make around here. Wood is easily degraded by moisture, which then is eaten by mold. Maybe animals will chew on it. It just degrades very naturally and very rapidly. Something a little bit more durable but equally hard to find are bone implements. And these are all sewing tools or other carved bone structures, but they're so small that you probably wouldn't even notice them unless you were sifting the soil that you're looking at. If you're walking through a farm field, I have probably walked over a ton of these, but they are rare and you have to be looking for them to find them in most cases. And then beads, lastly. And again, Al has some great beads in the cabinet over to the side over there. They come in all shapes and sizes. They're easy to spot because of their color, but they're small to spot because of their size. They range anywhere from ½ inch in diameter down to 1/8 of an inch, the little seed beads, which you may never find. I've only found one in my extensive digging, and that was just an off chance in a cornfield.
Are they shell?
It is glass, and it's blue. I have bone shell beads, but they were found under the soil. They do not last very long because of the acidic conditions of the soil, but these glass beads will hang around for forever. So to kind of start to wrap things up here, what do you do? Don't go out searching for things. Don't go home and grab a shovel and find the highest point on your property and just start digging. Because when people do that, like this gentleman here decided to grab a stick and prod into this embankment here, he found a full ceramic jar, which is great. It was probably preserved. I have no idea whatever happened to it. Maybe somebody here does, but this is when things get lost. If you do find something, you have to preserve it, whether it's an arrowhead or a piece of pottery or charred corn, anything that you find, you have to preserve it first. Don't put it in your pocket. Do not throw it into a cigar box. Keep it in a Ziploc bag, bring it home, set it out, treat it with respect, and have someone clean it for you, or clean it yourself if you think that you're able to, so that it can be examined by someone who might be a little bit more knowledgeable on it. Location is particularly important. If you go to eBay right now, you will find hundreds of thousands of arrowheads on there, authentic and not, they claim to be from one area or they claim to be from another. We don't know if they're real, we don't know anything about them. Once you take an arrowhead from that field and you don't document where you found it, who you are, the date, things like that, the historical value is lost, and you may as well just throw it back into that field. From an archaeological standpoint, if you want to just collect arrowheads for the fun of it, then that's your prerogative. On your own private land, you're free to do whatever you want.
What do you do, GPS coordinates or something?
You could GPS coordinate, you could make a pile of rocks and call someone. I have an app on my phone where you can get GPS coordinates. Relative, especially in a plowed field, because of the movement of the soil over hundreds of years with the farming implements. That location where you found the piece was probably not where it was put in the first place. So relative would be okay in that scenario. The shell beads that I found, I can tell you within inches of where I pulled them off.
Is that New York City?
That is New York City.
That's up near Alexander Hamilton's home, Range.
Really?
Yeah.
Lastly, and I can't stress this enough, if you find something, an arrowhead, a piece of pottery, a full pot, pipe, whatever you find, do not sell it to some random individual. They do have a value to them, they are worth money, but to certain collectors. For example, for me, I work in this area. I'm here today speaking to you about this area with my artifacts from this area. I love this area. I grew up in Atisco. I want to create a large collection of things. I want to know where they came from, who found them. I love the provenance. The history behind it is incredible to me, and you have to have it or else it's insignificant as a piece. If you sell it to some random individual who will pay you the most money, that's great, they have the piece and you have money in your pocket, but you're not doing anything for history. You're hurting the people who made it, you're hurting everyone down the line. So to summarize, thousands and thousands of years of human history. I mean, we went back to the Ice Age, 12,000 BC, and then that little girl that they found in a cave in Montana. Right up until today, when one of you goes home in your cornfield and you find an arrowhead, that is all culture of the native people. And if you don't properly record that information, it's worthless. That's what I want to instill in you today, is to be cognizant of things that you may find, be respectful of them, make some notations, save them for the grandkids or whatnot, but at least keep a record of what it is, where you found it, and that way future generations can study it and we can learn. And in 50 years from now, there will be another young guy standing here giving a way better presentation because of all the work that you did. We know that there are local villages here, especially in Highland Forest. That area was cleared. I can't tell you the person who found the artifacts there, and I personally don't know where they were found, but there was a village up there, and with all the high ground around here, I know that there are other villages. If you do go out on your own private land with a shovel or a backhoe and you happen to find something, just preserve history. We're here at the Historical Society today to learn about history. If we don't record things properly and treat things with respect, we may as well just not even be here, because history will cease to exist. That's the take-home point today. Thousands of years of culture and evolution of the Native Americans, and we can help to preserve that by doing what's right when you find something in your field. Treat it with respect, keep it, or put it in the hands of someone who will care for it for a very long time. Are there any questions? That's not my cat. And I really don't mean the bottom part, but it's too funny not to put in there. Yes, sir.
Did they build any rock structures?
rock structures were incorporated in some of the earthworks around here, so the Onondaga people, I'm not aware of any, but if you go a little bit further west into maybe Seneca, Cayuga territory, Mike, you might be able to shed some light on this.
Yeah, about the only rock structures that we ever run into, believe it or not, are eel weirs underwater off Frontenac Island in Cuba Lake by Union Springs. There's like 4 or 5 of them, big circles, and they would herd the eels into those structures. But they did very, very little with rock. That's about the only thing we ever see.
So that's like a rock wall underground to herd and to fish to congregate there.
That's correct. The only time you see them is when they repair the locks at Mud Lock, and usually about November, and they reduce the lake level a lot. They let a lot of the water out of Cuba Lake, and then the water goes down, and you can literally walk around, and you're not supposed to do that. But pick up arrowheads, and that is when these weirs become visible.
Were there other questions?
I was brought up in the Hudson Valley
Okay.
in Marlboro, New York. We live 5 miles west of the river in the Marlboro Mountains, which are the foothills of the Catskills.
Right.
And there's a big ridge there. And we own 40 acres, and a lot of it was part of the mountains. And then some of it was berries, grapes, and fruit trees. My great-grandmother's owned the property, and my great-grandfather paid the taxes. But anyway, we found arrowheads all over the place. And it wasn't like dug up property, because but then my father built he did a huge garden organically and everything. And then he started doing stuff, since he was sifting with hardware cloth, what he'd find. He found pipes, he found arrowheads, all kinds of stuff. So he didn't know anything about it, you know. And I'll have to ask my brother if he still has it. But it was in situ there, and it was at the bottom of a big knoll, where in the late 1800s, they built the house that I grew up in. But he also found other stuff there, and he said it's so rocky, you know. And we always say the glacier brought the rocks, and there were huge boulders and everything like that. And of course, there were impressions of sea shells and stuff in the rock, the boulders and everything.
Right.
And so my father said, "Oh God, the glacier and everything. Oh, all these rocks and you know, everything." He said, "Oh, don't you know? Here, you're actually digging up the foundation of the original log cabin." So I thought it was funny.
But was it true? Was there an actual cabin?
Oh yeah, sure. Oh yeah, sure. My grandfather told them, and he grew up there. They lived in it.
And depending on how old it was, maybe it was a cabin at the time when we had, you know, the first European contact, when Europeans went to live with the natives and natives came in to live with the Europeans. They would share houses sometimes. That might explain why maybe there was a mix of, you know, some European goods, maybe some non-European goods. But keeping a collection like that in the family and knowing exactly where it came from, that's exactly what I'm trying to preach today. Because when you lose that,
Well, that's what
just becomes a box of
the
things.
Palestinians came over and lived with the blacks, because they were dispersed. And of course, they were dispersed even more into Canada, because they sided with the British in certain wars. And
Yoo-hoo, we can't really hear the exchange. We got a few more questions.
Is there a question?
Go ahead.
If I could. I think it's very, very interesting presentation, and you put a whole lot of really useful pieces of information up there, and thank you for clarifying about the Iroquois Confederacy and the map, because a lot of us take great pride in that. I had an opportunity when I was in state government to help facilitate the return of some, well, we would call them artifacts, some people would, to the Onondagas for reburial. You may be familiar with that up across from the prison. And it was a painful experience that the Onondagas went through for a long time. A couple of the chiefs had actually made it their life life's work to track down what to them are sacred remains. And that includes not only bones, but sometimes other things buried with them. But we would often refer to as artifacts. So I'm wondering if you have had much interaction with the Onondagas and with the elders and the clan mothers with your discoveries.
I've had none, because nothing that I have found personally, to the best of my knowledge and in consultation with very well-known archaeologists, have no association with a burial. There might be one or two people who disagree with that, but the things that I find, like those charred squash seeds and bone splinters and whatnot, they're indicative of just general everyday activity, farming, hunting, and whatnot. I have never uncovered any human remains or even searched for them. And in fact, I purposefully did not include that in this presentation, and I'll tell you why. When the natives would bury someone, it's typically below the plow level, so below, you know, what a normal farm machinery would reach. You have to deliberately go out and find a burial, unless you're happy or you're lucky enough to stumble on one. And I don't mean lucky enough, but you stumble upon one. If you do find a body, or the remains of a body, I should say, the first thing that you need to do is you need to call the police. Because you have a body on your property. They're going to want to know about it. And from there, they will contact the elders of the Onondaga Nation or whomever they believe those remains belong to. And then that would become property of the Onondaga Nation. And you should be respectful of the fact that that's someone's loved one, maybe generations ago, but they take those remains and they rebury them with 100% spiritual belief that they need to be reinterred somewhere and they cannot be disturbed. It's inhumane to just dig up the remains of a human, put them on display in your living room or whatever. They did do that back in the 1800s, but that is not accepted anymore. I'm not one for being politically correct or you know, anything like that, but it's just immoral. Ethically, I could never do it. If I were to encounter something that I thought was human, and I found some teeth that I thought may be human, I brought them and I had them forensically identified. They were not human, and therefore I kept them because they were deer teeth or something like that. If they had turned out to be human, I would have the Onondagas at my site.
Good. Well, you might want to include in your list of what to do, contacting the Onondagas, because they appreciate that call, and they'll often send someone out, and what might seem to be a routine find might have some special meaning for them beyond what an archaeologist might recognize. One other little follow-up.
Sure.
The face that you found, the pottery face.
Yes.
Where was that identified, or how was that determined to be Native American?
It was found in a midden within a known Onondaga village, along with those charred squash seeds, wampum shells, or beads rather, and a cooking platform.
Okay.
And, as well as hundreds and hundreds of pottery shards, so almost like a dump.
Well, one of the Onondaga teachings was that when they make dolls and when they design other pieces of art, they don't put faces on them. You see the little corn dolls that they sell, and they're well sought after souvenirs. They don't have faces on them, and their belief is that only the creator can make a face. So if indeed it is a pottery face, it may be pre-Onondaga, and if you haven't taken over to Onondaga, I think it'd be great to get in touch with somebody over there, and I could give you some names afterwards. But thank you very much for a lovely program and for mentioning as kindly as you did about the bones.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I went to the same ceremony she did when they buried, and it was a very, very impressive ceremony. Chief deerskin, and after Chief Waterman and his attendants had gone around and placed them in burial holes, everyone there went around with dirt that we placed in each hole. I did 2, I think you did 2. They both were the same format and both were run by Chief Waterman.
And after he concluded the ceremony, we all sat there and a group of hawks came and circled where we were. It was a very profound moment.
Oh, and that's exactly why we need to be cognizant of the things that we're doing, whether it be an arrowhead or a bone or whatever you find in the field. There are people out there who actually, they care about these things, and it's their culture, so that's why we need to be very careful about what we do. Yes, ma'am?
There are 2 things that I'd like to share with everybody here, including you, and that one of them is the Scano Center, Peace Center on Onondaga Lake Parkway, that has just recently opened last year.
The former St. Marie?
It's on the grounds of the former St. Marie, and it's a Scano. It tells all about the Haudenosaunee history. There's a tremendous amount of information inside that museum, mostly things you read. But then when the weather clears and it's warmer, the outside portion has been changed into places where you can go in and view some of the artifacts of the earlier years. So that's Scano, that's one thing. The second thing is the Great Swamp Conservancy. They have right now, somebody has put in a display of, I don't know who it is, of artifacts, bones from some of the animals that were found in the Great Swamp area, such as the mammoths, the mastodons, and other large animals. And they have a tooth that's like about as bigger than 2 bricks put together, that size. And that they have a display pretty well founded. And one of the interesting things is that a long time ago, a lot of these bones were found from a single animal, and there was no place to keep it in Canastota area. So it was sent to Albany. And now the native people want that back here, and they have a way of displaying it now in a very nice air-conditioned building that's warm in the winter and cool in the summer. They have a place now where it could be displayed. So they're working to get that animal back. I think it was probably not a mammoth, but probably more like a mastodon, smaller. So, Great Swamp Conservancy, north of Canastota.
Well, this has been really wonderful, and people come around. Now, if you have some more questions, you can come around and talk to Jonathan here. This has been really a good session, I'm sure. He's got a lot more he can tell you. And we've also, folks, we got some great refreshments coming up, and you can have some of those and talk to your friends.
Chuck, I think that